Tonight, the latest member of the El Chapo family is in Chicago's federal lockup.
Chapo's son is accused of helping to lead one of the most bloodthirsty cartels on earth, a group responsible for thousands of murders and hundreds of thousands of overdose deaths.
On the surface, life inside a cartel looks like power, money, and control. But the moment the cuffs click, the fall is brutal and fast. What happens when the most feared men alive are told they'll never taste freedom again? In this episode, we witness cartel and criminal figures crumble when the sentence hits. And if you ask around, people still get tense at the mention of Guzmán López, El Chapo's son.
Tonight's this man, Joaquin Guzmán López, is being spared from the death penalty, a punishment federal authorities initially said was a possibility.
But now all eyes are on him as he stands before the court, facing the weight and reacting to his life sentence. When power end in chains. What began with fireworks to welcome the new year ended with bodies in the street and a G-Wagon torn apart like tissue. It was the 5th of January 2023 when the quiet town of Jesus Maria in Sinaloa, Mexico, normally the kind of place that never makes the news, was thrown into full-blown chaos. That morning, the Mexican military finally got their guy, Ovidio Guzmán López, known as El Raton, son of El Chapo. But this wasn't some calm, low-key arrest. It was war in broad daylight, like a military raid ripped from an action movie. Think Black Hawk Down, but in real life. The streets were torn up. The town looked like it had been through a war. Let's rewind to October 2019, the month Ovidio first got caught. The Sinaloa cartel erupted in response. Gunmen turned the city into a war zone. Gunfire in the streets, soldiers taken hostage, even military families were threatened. It got so out of hand that the government let him go. 13 people died, and Mexico's image took a hit worldwide. After that, Ovidio vanished, bouncing between luxury hideouts, living rich but quiet. Then he reappeared in Jesus Maria, a small town of 5,000 where people didn't see him as a criminal. To many, he was the guy who helped out, who paid for things. A protector. Nobody talked. But in December 2022, he got too comfortable. Threw a massive New Year's bash. Flew in family, his wife, kids, even his mom, El Chapo's third wife. There were armed guards everywhere. Food, drugs, loud music. But most of his men? Too drunk or too high to react if anything went down. That's when the military made their move. At 4 a.m. on January 5th, helicopters flew in low, straight into Jesus Maria. There's only one road in and out, so they didn't wait. Ovidio was still in bed when they hit. Within minutes, he was in custody, airlifted out before his crew could even load their guns. Then, the retaliation began. The Sinaloa cartel went wild. Burning buses blocked highways, helicopters were shot at, tanks came in, and for 10 straight hours, bullets filled the air. By the time it was over, 29 dead, 21 cartel members arrested, and the town left looking like a battlefield. A week later, reporters got access to Ovidio's home. What they found was haunting. Bullet holes everywhere. Blood on the floor, furniture, even in the bathroom. His bedroom was like a bunker. 40 guns inside, including one meant to shoot down aircraft. But what hit hardest were his daughter's rooms. Toys still in place, tiny shoes on the floor, and a small blood-stained blanket in the corner. A guest room had been turned into a first aid spot for wounded men. Outside, his Mercedes and bulletproof G-Wagon looked like Swiss cheese. The town was left reeling. Homes destroyed, kids missing, and locals claimed soldiers looted whatever they could from Ovidio's place. Jesus Maria hasn't been the same since. Then, on September 15, 2023, Ovidio was extradited to the U.S. on account of drug charges, a huge win in the fight against cartels. But his reaction was calm and collected, almost like he knew this day would come. He showed barely any emotion and definitely no sign of remorse. However, in 2024, Another man, caught with a bag of marijuana, was sentenced to 20 years in prison. No helicopters, no gunfights, no tanks. Just a guy and a system that doesn't always play fair. El Chapo. From the dusty backroads of Sinaloa to the steel bars of America's most feared prison, Joaquin El Chapo Guzmán built an empire with blood, fear, and cold ambition. It's wild to think the man who moved billions in drugs once started off broke, selling weed as a teen on the streets. And yet, there he was, wiping away tears in a U.S. courtroom. The same man who ran Mexico's drug trade like royalty, now facing life behind the thickest walls America could offer. Born on April 4, 1957, in a poor mountain village, Chapo's childhood was no fairy tale. His father was half rancher, half drug runner, and fully abusive. He let young Joaquin tag along on drug runs, but kept every cent for himself while the family starved. So Chapo took matters into his own hands. With help from a few cousins, he began growing his own marijuana to support his siblings. When his father kicked him out, Chapo didn't crumble. He dove deeper into the drug world. He linked up with the Guadalajara cartel, Mexico's top operation at the time, and climbed fast. Not by talking, but by doing. If you held up a shipment, you didn't get a warning. You got buried. His efficiency and lack of hesitation caught the attention of Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, the godfather of Mexican trafficking. But when Gallardo was arrested, Chapo didn't slow down. In 1987, alongside a few trusted allies, he launched what would become the most feared drug cartel in Mexico, the Sinaloa cartel. What made Chapo different wasn't just how much he moved, it was how he moved it. He transformed smuggling, building underground tunnels beneath the US-Mexico border. These weren't crude holes. These were engineered shafts with rails and lights. He trafficked it all: cocaine, heroin, meth, ecstasy, fentanyl. And according to US agents, no one funneled more poison into America than him. But power attracts attention and heat. He was arrested in 1993 and again in 2014. Both times he vanished. One escape came via a laundry cart. The other, a mile-long tunnel carved directly into his prison cell. But in 2016, the curtain finally fell. No more bribes, no more tunnels. Just 4 cold walls inside ADX Florence, the most secure prison in the U.S. on July 17, 2019. Joaquin El Chapo Guzmán was handed a life sentence, plus 30 more years, and ordered to forfeit over $12 billion. Even then, he stayed calm. No panic, no breakdown, just a composed man who smiled and waved to his family in the courtroom. When given a chance to speak, he didn't plead. Instead, he condemned the way he'd been treated behind bars, calling it psychological, emotional, and mental torture, and accused the United States government of trampling on his rights. The man who once ruled from mountaintop mansions now wakes up behind bars, and this time, he's not getting out. Jorge Eduardo Costilla Sanchez. Whenever Mexico's most terrifying drug lords come up in conversation, it's always the usual suspects: El Chapo, El Mayo, El Mencho. But behind the headlines is a name most have never heard: Jorge Eduardo Costilla Sanchez. Born on the 1st of August, 1971 in Tamaulipas, Mexico, Costilla didn't come from the usual path of crime. In fact, he started out like many ordinary citizens, working a steady job in local government. But all it took was the wrong set of friends and a few dark choices for his life to take a turn most wouldn't dare consider. By the late 1990s, Costilla had slipped quietly into the inner circles of the Gulf cartel. His rise wasn't accidental, it was strategic. He developed a close alliance with the cartel's leader at the time, Ociel Cardenas Guillen. Ociel recognized something dark in him: a taste for control and a dangerous willingness to spill blood to keep it. One day, the cartel's inner circle stumbled upon 2 men poking around, undercover DEA agents. The instinct? Eliminate them. But the agents didn't beg for their lives. They gave a warning. Killing United States federal officers would invite fire from Washington like nothing the cartel had ever seen. Surprisingly, they let them go. Fast forward to mid-March 2003. Ociel was captured in a blazing gunfight with Mexican authorities. Just like that, leadership fell into Costilla's hands. But instead of taking the throne alone, he attempted something risky, sharing power with Ociel's brother Antonio and a few other cartel bosses. Ego, ambition, and distrust ripped through the Gulf cartel like wildfire. Internal battles soon spiraled into open warfare, especially with Los Zetas, their once loyal enforcers who turned rogue. What followed was not just a falling out, it became one of the deadliest cartel conflicts Mexico had ever seen. Eventually, all the bloodshed caught up with him. On a quiet 12th of September, 2012, Costilla was finally cornered and arrested in Tampico. He didn't resist. No bullets, no chase, just silence, like a man who had seen the final chapter coming. Strangely, few even knew what he looked like. Only 2 photos of him existed publicly. The rest of his identity lived in whispers. Then came the endgame. In 2015, he was extradited to the United States. During the handover, he sat there, blank-faced. No emotion, no protest. Just the heavy stillness of a man who knew he'd lost the game. A United States court handed him a life sentence. And just like that, one of Mexico's most shadowy and feared cartel bosses vanished with the cold echo of a prison door shutting behind him. Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, but he was the reason Mexico became ground zero in the global drug war. Long before Mexico was synonymous with cartels and kingpins, one man quietly laid the foundation for everything that would follow. His name was Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. Born on January 8, 1946, in the town of Bella Vista, Gallardo didn't fit the mold of the stereotypical drug boss. He didn't grow up in the gutters or fight his way out of poverty. He finished high school, studied business in college, and appeared to be on a path to a decent career. After finishing school, he joined the Mexican Federal Judicial Police. Before long, he became the personal bodyguard to the governor of Sinaloa, Leopoldo Sanchez Celis. That job came with far more than a paycheck. It opened doors, giving him deep ties within Mexico's political elite. With powerful allies and protection from above, Gallardo saw a unique chance to build something massive. By the 1970s, he had founded the Guadalajara cartel. While others were still figuring out how to move product, he forged partnerships with Colombian traffickers who supplied the drugs. Gallardo handled the logistics, smuggling vast amounts into the United States. Under his leadership, the cartel became a drug empire. At its height, the operation was said to bring in around $5 billion each year. But money like that doesn't stay quiet forever. In the early 80s, a US DEA agent named Enrique Kiki Camarena landed in Mexico. Camarena began digging into Gallardo's operation. What he found was massive. Vast marijuana farms and corrupt politicians neck-deep in the supply chain. He sounded the alarm, and authorities began to crack down hard. Gallardo wasn't just losing product, he was losing control. He wanted revenge. On the noon of February 7, 1985, Camarena and his pilot were abducted by 5 men as they left the American consulate in Guadalajara. They were tortured for over 30 hours, interrogated, beaten, broken, and then murdered. Their bodies were dumped like garbage. The message couldn't have been louder. The fallout, however, was immediate. Washington demanded answers. Mexican authorities, many of whom were in Gallardo's pocket, stalled, but pressure built, and they were forced to act. In 1989, police finally came for him. They found Gallardo in his home. No shootout, no escape attempt, calm and barefoot in a bathrobe. He was sentenced to 40 years for Camarena's murder, among other charges. Time passed and new cartels rose, but Gallardo stayed behind bars, growing older, sicker, and quieter. In 2022, at 76, age and illness caught up with him. With his body failing him, he was transferred to house arrest. Angie Valencia. She ruled the runway and the drug trade. Angie Valencia wasn't just a model, she was a queenpin, crowned a beauty queen by day, trafficking cocaine by night, with models as her couriers and the catwalk as her camouflage. Born on May 25, 1977 in Colombia, Angie was always someone you noticed. With striking looks and effortless beauty, She stormed the beauty pageant world in the early 2000s, dazzling audiences and securing her place in the country's fashion scene. But behind the tiaras and photo shoots, something darker brewed. After splitting from her boyfriend, a notorious drug lord known in whispers as El Monstro, Angie made a decision few would dare. She would run her own game, and not just any game. She built a drug operation so sleek, so calculated, it earned her a chilling title, the Cleopatra of cocaine. She wasn't about shootouts or chaos. Angie ran her cartel like a CEO runs a tech startup. Her specialty? Smuggling cocaine from Argentina to England, hidden not just in luggage, but inside the very women she employed. But these weren't average recruits. Angie personally selected models from her fashion circles to act as drug couriers. With their high-end wardrobes and industry connections, they passed as innocent travelers. No suspicion, no red flags. Beneath it, her former lover's teachings were the real blueprint. El Monstro had deep ties with Mexican cartels and had shown her the inner workings, how to launder money, transport narcotics, and disappear when needed. And for a while, Angie did just that. She moved in silence and always 3 steps ahead until she wasn't. In 2010, one of her couriers, a model named Ariel, was caught at Ezeiza International Airport in Buenos Aires with a massive load of cocaine. The bust blew Angie's whole operation wide open. Authorities were on high alert. A warrant was issued. The net was closing. Just 2 days after celebrating her 33rd birthday, on May 27th, Angie was found in a small hostel, living under a fake name, the Queen of Cool, suddenly cornered. In court, she didn't flinch. Her expression was ice, silent, poised, and unreadable. But when the judge delivered the sentence, life in prison, her mask cracked. For the first time, her composure slipped. Tears welled up. That steely image shattered under the weight of finality. Her empire was gone. So was her freedom. George Guel Thomas. At first glance, you'd expect a man handed 7 life sentences to break down. But George Caval Thomas didn't do any of that. His face was unreadable and stoic. George wasn't an average drug lord or street criminal. He was the head of one of the most feared factions in all of Africa, the 28s, a ruthless arm of the notorious Numbers Gang. This syndicate began within the walls of South African prisons, but it quickly spilled out, stretching across the country and branching into several deadly divisions. Among these, the 28s are considered the gang's core, its bloodline. Their job? Carrying out executions, eliminating rivals, and proving loyalty through unspeakable acts. If a recruit didn't show enough cruelty, they were shoved into the lowest rung of the gang. There, abuse was used like a hammer, pounding out the weakness until something colder took its place. George thrived in that world. He didn't just survive, he ruled. Alongside his men, he crushed anyone who dared challenge their grip, especially across Western Cape Town. But that reign came crashing down when authorities arrested him on 55 charges, including 7 counts of murder. Even behind the thick walls of solitary confinement, George refused to stay quiet. Somehow, he managed to stay connected, making over 33,000 phone calls. From that dark cell, he continued giving orders, arranging hits on those who stood in his way. One name stood out among his targets, Curtis Esterhuisen. The gang tried to take Curtis out 6 different times but failed. Why the obsession? Curtis had agreed to testify in court, and that made him a threat George wanted erased, along with anyone else willing to speak against him. In court, George's lawyer attempted to rewrite his story, painted him as a simple man, claimed he didn't smoke, had a bank account, and earned a living selling fish, but the judge wasn't buying it. The verdict came down hard, 7 life sentences, each one tied to a life taken. Strangely, George didn't react. No tears, no outburst, just that same blank stare, like the sentence meant nothing to him. But prison has a way of peeling back the layers. After some time inside, something seemed to shift. George's tone changed. In a rare moment, he admitted, "If I had made different choices, I wouldn't be where I am now." Pedro Espinosa. Inside the cold steel confines of California's San Quentin State Prison, faces rarely show emotion. That same chilling stillness could be seen on the face of Pedro Espinosa. A member of the 18th Street Gang, he sat motionless in court, even as the full weight of justice pressed down on him. His crime? Taking the life of a promising high school athlete. And all because of a red backpack. The victim, Jamiel Andre Shaw II, was a junior at Los Angeles High. A standout student and a true all-rounder. He played football, basketball, baseball, and even the piano. He also ran track. His future was bright, practically glowing, and he had strong parents supporting his every step. His mother, Anita Shaw, was deployed overseas, serving her second tour in Iraq. At the exact time her son's life was brutally cut short, Espinosa, born in the late 80s, wasn't just any troubled youth. He had entered the United States illegally and already had a track record. In 2007, he was arrested for gun possession and even assaulting a police officer. But the real error was the one that would cost an innocent boy his life, which came in the early part of 2008. Despite knowing his legal status and criminal history, authorities released Espinosa from jail 4 months ahead of schedule. That decision would turn fatal in less than 48 hours. At around 8:40 in the evening on March the 2nd, 2 Hispanic men emerged from a white vehicle. They approached Shaw, who was just a few blocks away from his home after a visit to the Beverly Center. The men confronted him, demanding to know what gang he belonged to. One of those men was Espinosa, the reason for the confrontation. Shaw's backpack, it featured a Spider-Man design and was red. That color alone led them to believe he was part of the Bloods, a rival gang. Shaw, caught off guard, didn't answer. In response, they shot him where he stood. His father heard the gunshot from their home. He tried to call his son, unaware that it was already too late. When there was no answer, instinct took over. He ran outside and discovered what no parent ever should: his son lying lifeless on the pavement. He stayed by his side until medics arrived, but by 9:55 that night, Shaw was pronounced dead at the hospital. For Espinosa, this was his first day of freedom, and yet, within hours, he had already destroyed another life. It didn't take long before he was tracked down and arrested. The legal process stretched on for 4 years, but in May of 2012, the verdict came down hard. Espinosa was sentenced to death. The judge, solemn and firm, announced that Pedro Espinosa would be executed within the walls of San Quentin by a method chosen by the law, on a date the court would later determine. Abel Galagos. Nobody wakes up thinking the day will end in blood and gasoline, but that's exactly how Simone's story closed. In the year 2018, a mother of 2, Simone Duran, made a choice that would lead her down a dark and irreversible path. She had met a man online, 36-year-old Abel Galagos. Their chats seemed innocent at first, the kind that start with curiosity and slowly build trust. Eventually, they agreed to meet in person, gathering at a house in Denver. Alongside them was another man named René Francisco Rosales and a handful of others. What exactly drew Simone to that house remains unclear. But whatever her reasons were, that meeting would become the most tragic decision of her life. After spending some time inside, Simone left with Galagos and Rosales, but at some point Rosales split off, taking a different path home. That left Simone alone with Galagos, and that's when the situation began to turn sinister. Galagos lured her to a parking lot near West Colfax and Kipling, a location he had prearranged with another associate. That man was only identified as Quintana. What happened next was nothing short of horrifying. Together, Galagos and Quintana assaulted Simone. They forced her into the back of a car, then drove her to a remote, shadowed part of town. Once there, they dragged her out of the vehicle. 10 bullets followed. Her body collapsed to the ground, lifeless and soaked in blood. But the horror didn't stop there. The 2 men fled, only to return later, this time with gasoline. They set her body on fire, reducing what was left to ash. The story might have ended there, another brutal crime buried in silence. But fate had other plans. Later that same year, on November 20th, Gallegos was arrested, though not for Simone's murder. It was a different offense, but as the investigation unfolded, the pieces began to connect. Soon, authorities realized the man in custody for a separate crime was also responsible for Simone's cold-blooded execution. And this wasn't Gallegos' first run-in with the law. He was already on federal probation when Simone's life was taken. Not only that, his probation had been revoked 8 separate times. The murder marked his 6th felony conviction. In court, the judge did not hold back. He spoke not just as a legal authority, but as a man disturbed by what he had seen. He described the act as chilling in its casualness, a complete and deliberate erasure of another human being. Looking directly at Gallegos, he said he had no place among the rest of society. Then he passed down the sentence. There was no dramatic outburst, no sudden gasp, just the sound of a life condemned. As Gallegos was led out of the courtroom, family and friends looked on in tears. That walk was the beginning of what would be the rest of his life behind prison walls. Caius Veiovis. Caius Veiovis wasn't part of any cartel, but his life played out like a dark Gothic tale filled with insanity and rituals. He was loosely connected to the notorious biker gang known as the Hells Angels. Founded back in the late 1940s in California, the club began as a merger of motorcycle groups who claimed their bond was simply a love for the open road. But that's not what authorities in places like Germany and the Netherlands believed. In those countries, chapters were banned outright, labeled as criminal organizations. He wasn't born with the name Caius Veiovis. He entered the world as Roy Gutfinski Guinor, a troubled child from Pittston, Pennsylvania. Raised by adoptive parents, Roy's childhood was far from peaceful. Trouble found him early, and he welcomed it. One of his first run-ins with the law, carrying a combat-style knife with twin blades. He was still a minor when that earned him a year on probation, but instead of learning a lesson, he sank deeper. Through his teens, he drifted through rehab centers, addicted to heroin, lost in hallucinogens, and teetering on the edge of a complete breakdown. Once, he even assaulted a hospital worker during a drug-fueled episode. But what truly made people stop and stare was his appearance. Roy reinvented himself into something monstrous, more fiction than flesh. Horned implants jutted from his forehead. His fingers bore green tattoos that mimicked bones. Between the horns, the numbers 666 were inked into his skin. He called himself a vampire, a Satanist. The name Caius was inspired by a character from Twilight, and Veiovis from a Roman deity of the underworld. Then came the incident that sent chills through an entire town. August of 1999. Still just a teenager, Caius and his 17-year-old girlfriend used a razor blade to slice open the back of another girl. What came next was worse. They licked the blood from the blade like a ritual. The girl survived, needing over 30 stitches to close the wounds, but the scars were more than just physical. As horrifying as that was, it wasn't the end of his story. More than a decade later, in 2011, Caius's name resurfaced, this time in a triple homicide. 3 men, David Glasser, Edward Frampton, and Robert Chadwell, were abducted and executed in Massachusetts. The motive? Prosecutors claimed the goal was to silence Glasser, who was preparing to testify in another case. Caius was arrested along with 2 other suspects. By now, he was almost unrecognizable, head to toe in tattoos, still preaching vampirism, and as eerie as ever. The trial came in 2014. Caius tried to keep a straight face, but the courtroom wasn't buying his act. The evidence was undeniable. He was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and witness intimidation. The sentence? Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And when the verdict was read, Caius didn't scream, he didn't cry, he didn't flinch. He just sat there, silent and hollow. Jeremy Christian. A name that once meant nothing, now forever in the dark pages of American hate crime history. He wasn't just another angry face in the crowd. He openly claimed ties to the Ku Klux Klan, a group so soaked in hate and violence that the United States government officially classifies them as domestic terrorists. The KKK's list of targets? Nearly anyone who isn't white. Black Americans, immigrants, Jews, Latinos, Catholics, Asian Americans, LGBTQ+ folks, you name it. And in May of 2017, Jeremy Christian showed Portland, Oregon, what hate looks like up close. It happened on a Max light rail train. 2 teenage girls sat quietly, minding their business. One was black, the other a Somali girl wearing a hijab. Then Christian stepped on board, and everything changed. He started screaming. Witnesses say his voice cut through the train, spewing hatred about Muslims, Jews, even Christians. He talked about death, beheadings, and shouted things like, "Go back home! We need real Americans here." That's when a brave young man, Taliesin Namkai Meche, just 23 years old, stood up and started recording the tirade on his phone. He lunged, smashed the phone, and in a flash, chaos broke out. Christian pulled a knife. Within seconds, Taliesin was stabbed. Then Ricky Best, a 53-year-old Army veteran, stepped in to help and was stabbed too. Both men died on that train, standing up to hate. A third hero, Micah Fletcher, was also stabbed. He survived, but barely. Once in custody, Christian flipped the script. He walked into court all quiet and misty-eyed, like a man filled with regret. Maybe he thought a little show of remorse would soften the blow, but that mask didn't stay on for long. During the trial, one of the same teenage girls he had verbally abused was in the courtroom. Seeing her again triggered something vile. He snapped, right there in front of the judge. He shouted slurs, cursed at her, and even said he wished he had killed her too. The courtroom froze. The act was over. The monster was out. The judge didn't need another second. She delivered the only sentence that fit: life in prison, with no possibility of parole. No more outbursts, no more speeches, just concrete walls, steel bars, and the echo of his own hatred for the rest of his life. Jeremy Christian didn't just take lives that day. He tore the mask off the kind of racism that still lurks beneath the surface in America. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.